begin with prayer. Mother, Father God, divine source of all that is, thank you. We are truly grateful for your divine gifts of life and love. We honor Jesus in his return to Jerusalem on Palm Sunday, and we acknowledge and affirm that we very much appreciate his willingness to come to earth, to live his life as a human, and to reveal your presence in us and all around us. We strive to better understand and appreciate the significance of his life for our own lives. His efforts in his life have not been in vain, for we are here, we are listening, and we are walking our spiritual path, finding our way to you. Thank you for being patient with us. We thank you for your forgiveness and mercy, and we thank you for your eternal love. And so it is. Amen. Palm Sunday. I'm sure you've all heard many stories about Palm Sunday. Jesus made what has been labeled his triumphal entry into Jerusalem. That was the Sunday before he was arrested and crucified. It's hard year after year to find something new to say about biblical events and Jesus' life. The stories have been repeated without change. So I've been doing more research, and now I have a whole new take on the events leading up to Palm Sunday. My understanding has greatly enhanced by my research, so I want to share some of that with you. Long before that special day, Jesus ordained his 12 apostles and many disciples. There was a big difference between apostles and disciples. The apostles were asked to give up home, family, means of living, and to dedicate everything to following Jesus and spreading the new gospel. Disciples were not asked all of that. The path for disciples was less rigorous. Jesus repeatedly rehearsed his disciples and his apostles to the great motives of his mission on earth, and there were two. One, to reveal the universal Father to the humans, and two, to lead humans to become conscious of God and to believe, to have faith that they are children of the Most High. He didn't intend or want to be an object of worship, but deflected all that to his Father in heaven. It took the apostles a long time to really understand this idea. Everyone thought he was the long-awaited earthly Messiah, foretold by the prophets of old. Jesus didn't even allow his apostles to write down his sermons. He himself left nothing in writing, only in the hearts of his followers. Of all the daring things Jesus did in his earthly career, one of the most amazing was his choice to set aside 12 women for ministry work. This act was Jesus' emancipation proclamation, setting free all women and demonstrating his teaching that the kingdom of heaven has no rich or poor, neither free nor slave, not male or female, but all are equally children of God. This act shocked his 12 apostles. Women back then were not allowed to be on the main floor of any synagogue. The whole country was stirred up by this new proceeding, especially the Jewish leaders and the enemies of Jesus. None could understand the attributes of this God-man. Jesus taught a whole new way to live. He denounced the arbitrary rules of the Sanhedrin and the Jewish laws of sacrifice and all the ceremonies and symbols. He taught the equality of humans, equality of men and women, equality of different nationalities, something unheard of before. The common people were tired of being overtaxed, mistreated by Roman and Jewish authorities, and Jesus came teaching freedom from all that suffering. People wanted him to be the next king, to sit on David's throne, to rule the land with a new government. He talked about the kingdom in a spiritual way, but people took it in a materialistic way. Wherever he went, crowds gathered, and followed, hanging on his every word. People anticipated where he would go next and went ahead and waited for him. He taught with authority and had a commanding presence. He was a dignified manhood. He was good but natural. He didn't pose as a mild, sweet, gentle, and kind mystic. His teaching was thrillingly dynamic. He portrayed conquest by sacrifice, the sacrifice of pride and selfishness. By showing mercy, he meant to portray spiritual deliverance from all grudges, grievances, anger, and the lust for selfish power. He knew that leading humans into the great and living truths of God's kingdom would drive out all serious thought error. Jesus taught in almost every town, in the cities, in the countryside, on the west side of the Jordan River, on the east side, in the north end of the region, in the south end near Egypt, in synagogues, in homes, along riverbanks. He taught the crowds by day and instructed the apostles and the evangelists by night. The crowds that gathered were truly huge. Just one trip to Capernaum, Jesus made several of those, but in one trip, Peter estimated that no fewer than 1,000 people had been baptized into the kingdom of heaven. There had been many healings, both divine and faith-based. Thus, many people came seeking healing for physical and mental ailments. Jesus' fame, especially as a healer, spread quickly far and wide. The common people always gave him a favorable reception, but not the religious leaders in Jerusalem. They became increasingly alarmed and antagonistic, for Jesus was upending their whole theocracy. The Pharisees had formulated a systematic and dogmatic theology. Jesus was not a systematic teacher. He taught as the occasion served. He taught from everyday life with parables that people could understand. Tension was building. Jesus sometimes barely kept ahead of those who wanted his death. The Sanhedrin sent spies to mingle with the adoring crowds to catch Jesus in breaking their Jewish laws and to report about his words and activities. One Sunday morning, Jesus and his 12 apostles needed some rest. So they left some evangelists to teach the multitudes in Capernaum and went by boat to the opposite shore of Lake Galilee to a lovely park. The people saw the direction of Jesus' boat, and some people hired boats and others walked quickly 10 miles around the end of the lake. By mid-afternoon, 1,000 people had gathered around Jesus. Can you imagine 1,000 people around this church? How much room would they take up? 1,000 people? Many people had brought food with them, so everyone had food for Sunday evening, and the teaching continued late into the night. On Monday afternoon, the multitude had grown to more than 3,000 people. And long into that evening, more people arrived. By Wednesday noon, about 5,000 men, women, and children were assembled there in the park. By then, the food that the apostles had brought, as well as supplies of the crowd, was exhausted. Even though they were hungry, the people would not leave. Rumors spread through the crowd that Jesus must have selected this park outside the jurisdiction of Herod and the Sanhedrin as a proper place where he would be crowned king. The excitement and expectations rose hour by hour. Even the 12 apostles were still silently harboring this desire for Jesus, especially Judas Iscariot. About 5 o'clock, Jesus summoned James, Andrew, and Philip and asked, "What shall we do with the multitudes? They've been with us now 3 days, and many of them are hungry. They have no food." Philip suggested Jesus send them away to buy food for themselves. But Jesus didn't want to send them away hungry. A boy who was the general errand boy for the apostles had only 5 barley loaves and 2 dried fish left in their supply. For a moment, Jesus stood in silence. He turned suddenly to Andrew and said, "Bring me the loaves and fishes, and direct the people to sit down on the grass in companies of 100, and appoint a leader over each group, while you bring all the evangelists here to me." With his team around him, Jesus blessed the bread and the fish and distributed it to the 12, who passed it on to the evangelists, who passed it on to the people. When all was done, they took up 12 baskets of leftovers. This truly was a miraculous increasing and multiplying of food, which Jesus performed as a result of his conscious planning. His human pity plus his divine creative power equaled that which happened. At last the people thought, here was the event that turned the tide. Now Jesus' fame plus this stupendous wonder provided the impetus for the crowd to want to seize the master and make him the king. The idea spread like wildfire. Here is our king. Then Jesus stepped up onto a huge boulder and said, "My children, you humans mean well, but you are short-sighted and material-minded." This Galilean was there majestically posed in the glow of light, the twilight, looking every inch a king. He said, "How many times have I told you that my kingdom is not of this world? This kingdom of heaven is a spiritual brotherhood, and no man rules over it seated on a throne. If you must have a king, let the Father of lights be enthroned in the heart of each of you as the spirit ruler of all things." People were stunned and disheartened, and they left him. Many who had believed in him turned and followed him no more. Some months later, on a Saturday, the Sabbath morning, again in Capernaum, Jesus was deeply preoccupied and silent. He didn't eat. There was a tension of uncertainty and a great apprehension in all the apostles. That afternoon, Jesus left to preach in the synagogue. The 12 went along, but they were very depressed. A distinguished congregation awaited Jesus. 53 Pharisees and Sadducees were there. More than 30 of the leaders and rulers of the neighboring synagogues were also there. These Jewish leaders were acting directly under orders from the Sanhedrin at Jerusalem, and were the Orthodox vanguard come to start open warfare on Jesus and his disciples. Jesus preached his full gospel, his full message of God's presence. He also claimed to be the Son of God, come down to earth from the Father. At one point, Jesus took a breath, and a member of the Sanhedrin stood up and asked, "But are you not Jesus of Nazareth, the son of Joseph, the carpenter? Are not your father and mother, as well as your brothers and sisters, well known to many of us? How then is it that you appear here in God's house and declare that you have come down from heaven?" Murmuring started throughout the synagogue. Jesus tried again to explain himself. When he was done, the head of the synagogue dismissed the congregation, but the people would not leave. People crowded around Jesus, asking questions for another 3 hours. A Pharisee demanded that Jesus explain his authority and his right to teach. Jesus said he would give no sign or token. The religious leaders were agitated and wanted to arrest him then. The 12 apostles got him out of there and were very surprised at his change of attitude, his new militant manner. The crowds started to abandon him. A third of his associates deserted his cause. That Saturday night, a special meeting was held with Herod Antipas and representatives of the Jerusalem Sanhedrin. By Sunday morning, Herod had authorized the immediate arrest of Jesus. Jesus, his apostles, and many disciples headed north out of Galilee and spent the next year traveling and preaching his new gospel outside the reach of Herod and the Sanhedrin. Soon it was no longer necessary for Jesus to go out to teach the people. They now came to him in increasing numbers each week, not only from Palestine, but from the whole Roman world and the Near East. Finally, Jesus knew his hour had come, and his work on earth was ending. He had to go back to Jerusalem and Palestine and try once more to get the Jewish rulers to recognize his true nature. The key for the Jewish rulers was the idea of authority. The prophets of old stirred up trouble, for they boldly taught without authority, without having been duly instructed and ordained by the Sanhedrin. Lack of this high level of authority, especially with pretentious public speaking, indicated ignorant presumption or open rebellion. At that time, only the Sanhedrin could ordain an elder or teacher. And such a ceremony had to take place in the presence of at least 3 previously ordained persons. That bestowal qualified the person to be called rabbi and to act as a judge. Jesus didn't have that certification, that authority, so he was a rebel, pulling people away from the Jewish practices. Thus the rulers wanted him out, gone, dead. Jesus, as the Son of God, knew the outcome that lay ahead of him. He knew the only way he could get back into Jerusalem for the Passover feast and not be arrested was to make a big fanfare out of his arrival. There's safety in numbers. Jesus remembered the scripture from Zechariah saying, "Behold, your king comes to you as the lowly one, riding upon the foal of a donkey." This was his choice for a symbolic appeal, since his direct teaching had not influenced the rulers. He sent Peter and John to get the donkey, and by then several hundred pilgrims had gathered around. Several associates went ahead and stirred up the crowds. Several thousand visitors flocked to greet the dynamic wonder worker. People threw their robes on the street and cut branches from the trees to make a carpet of honor for the promised Messiah. As they approached Jerusalem and Jesus could see the city and the temple, he stopped the procession, and with much emotion he wept, saying, "O Jerusalem, if you had only known the things which belong to your peace and which you could so freely have had." On they went, and although Jesus didn't plan this reception, the crowd rejoiced, waving palm branches and shouting, "Hosanna." Many Pharisees and enemies of Jesus were in the throng, but because of the popular acclaim, they feared to arrest him. They knew the crowd would turn on them. Monday, Jesus and his 12 again went to the temple, where he found a great commercial and banking exchange going on, animals being sold for sacrifice, money changers and tax collectors. You see, the money changers were needed because for that feast, pilgrims came from all over the region with their coinage But the Jews had their own coins. And so people from outside Palestine had to exchange their coins to get to the temple. Jesus was attempting to preach the gospel when an argument started between a money changer and a visiting Jew. A herd of 100 cattle, bellowing, were being driven through the court to the animal pens. The noise was tremendous. Jesus paused silently but thoughtfully. Indignation rose in his soul over the unfair money and tax practices that were pushed on to the common people. Quickly, Jesus stepped down from the teaching platform, taking the whip from the boy who was driving the cattle, and swiftly, striding like a king, drove the animals from the temple. He also opened all the animal pens and released every creature. That action aroused the onlookers, and the crowd began to overturn the money tables. In a few moments, all the commerce had been driven out of the temple. The people set up guards so Jesus was not harmed. Tuesday morning, Jesus and the 12 headed to the temple in Jerusalem. And as Jesus was starting to speak, a group of students approached. They asked whether or not they should give tribute to Caesar. Jesus knew they had been rehearsed and sent by the Sanhedrin. And he gave his famous answer of rendering to Caesar what is his, and to God what is God's. Jesus fielded many questions that day, avoiding being trapped. That Tuesday afternoon, Jesus delivered his final address to the people. His message of mercy to mankind, coupled with his last denunciation of the false teachings and the bigoted rulers of Jews. Just before midnight, the Sanhedrin voted unanimously to impose the death sentence on both Jesus and Lazarus. They could not kill Jesus and allow Lazarus, a walking miracle, to live. Their bitter resentment could no longer be held back. Wednesday was the usual day of rest for Jesus and his associates, and this Wednesday was no exception. Jesus went into the hills alone. That morning, Judas left the group to meet with Caiaphas, the high priest. Judas was confused and very discontented with Jesus. Judas had decided that while Jesus was a well-meaning dreamer, he was not the expected deliverer of Israel. He had long been angry that Jesus didn't save John the Baptist, and he wanted a graceful way to withdraw from the movement. He was told that his departure would bring high praise and honor, and he would thus remove the stigma of being with the untaught Galilean. He was jealous of Peter, James, and John and their close contact with Jesus. His pride was so hurt, he was willing to abandon and betray Jesus. Thursday morning, Jesus gave his farewell address to 50 close associates. Judas was absent, but returned by late afternoon, just as Jesus was going to take the 12 apostles to Jerusalem for the Passover supper. They waited outside the city until dusk and went by back streets to the private home of Elijah Mark. Upstairs, the apostles were all surprised when there were no servants there to either serve the meal or to wash their feet before the dinner. They wondered if they were to choose seats by themselves. Judas stepped right up and took the seat to the left of the host's seat. John immediately took the seat to the right of the host's seat. Peter was so enraged, he walked around the table and chose the lowest seat, hoping Jesus would instruct him to replace either Judas or John. When Jesus arrived in the room, he surprised them all by washing their feet for them before the meal, by being the servant to them. this was to be their last supper together. And it was here Jesus said to Judas, "What you have decided to do, do quickly." That night, Jesus led the 11 apostles back to the camp at Gethsemane. He directed the apostles to their tents to rest, but asked Peter, James, and John to stay with him a while. They had never seen Jesus so heavy laden and sorrowful. While Jesus prayed, the apostles fell asleep due to exhaustion. Jesus prayed, "Father, I know it is possible to avoid this cup. All things are possible with you, but I have come to do your will. And while this is a bitter cup, I would drink it if it is your will." 3 times Jesus awakened the apostles, and the last time Judas approached with a band of armed soldiers. To be continued next Sunday. Think of the agony that Jesus experienced in Gethsemane. He knew what was coming. He prayed, "Let the bitter cup pass," but he was willing to endure human death. The Father desired his Son to finish his earth bestowal by passing through the creature experience of death, just as all mortals must experience material dissolution and passing from existence of time into the progression of eternity. Jesus' entry into Jerusalem seemed to be joyous, a triumphant event, but he knew what lay ahead. The triumph in Jerusalem was short-lived, for the Jews never accepted him. His triumph in our hearts is eternal. Without him, we might today all still be waiting for a Messiah, expecting an earthly king. Without him and his ministry, would we know about the glory of God and that we are God's children? We should be very grateful to him for this mercy and for bringing us the reality of an understanding of what God is. You and I have the same option the Jewish people had. Accept or not. In our time of meditation, let's focus on truly appreciating Jesus and his message. This is the time when we go within to connect again with God. We choose to refresh our understanding of self and of our divinity. Close your eyes for a private encounter with the Spirit of God and relax. Let the chair hold and support you.
What?
Let your shoulders down. Focus on your breathing gently in and out. Quiet the chatter in your mind and rest in your silence. Feel the life force within you. Know that your life is a gift from God. Let your intention for the next few minutes be to express your appreciation for the ministry of Jesus, our spiritual brother, our way shower, and his gospel of truth. Take a moment and find your spiritual center. Turn on your heart light. Make that connection with the Christ mind within you. Intend and choose a new way, humbly choosing to utilize the Christ mind within you. Knowing that serving others is a prime way of growing oneself spiritually and developing one's soul, have a two-way dialogue with the Divine Mind about how you are doing, and listen for answers deep within your mind. Knowing that Jesus is our shepherd and protects us, teaches us, and leads the way for us, have a two-way dialogue with Him and ask how you might make a better spiritual effort for your life. Now spend one more moment in silence with your one true source, your Creator, and rest in His perfect love, His unquestioning love, gentle and all-powerful love. In spite of all the stuff you've done in your life, open your heart and mind and feel His great love for you. Gently give thanks for your new understanding, for your new plan to improve your ways in assisting self and others to grow spiritually. Slowly, gently, bring your focus back to your body, to the chair, and to the room. And when you are ready, open your eyes. Let the Father of lights be enthroned in the heart of each of you as the Spirit ruler of all things. And so it is. Amen.